It was Saturday evening, and Joe was terrified. He'd locked himself inside his apartment in the hopes it would keep him from getting loose and hurting people. The place was a duplex, so there was that to think of. One of the apartments was empty since the old Irish broad who lived there had passed away while Joe was in the hospital. His downstairs neighbors were an annoying hipster couple. Joe hoped he wouldn't eat them, but he didn't really give a shit either way. There wouldn't be any big loss to anyone, but he didn't want to eat them. He didn't want to eat anyone, really. But the thought of eating a dude with a man bun, hell no, he thought, fuck that. Joe was sitting on the couch, which was roughly the same age as Sonny, and watching a VHS tape of Apocalypse Now for the 100th time. It was just getting good. Charlie Sheen's Pops was close to finding Fat Marlon Brando, but Joe couldn't focus. He was nervous as hell and couldn't think of anything beyond the inevitability that he would turn into a wolf. Maybe he wouldn't, he told himself, but that was bullshit and he knew it. He looked at the old Pabst Blue Ribbon clock hanging on the wall and saw that it was nearly 7. His time was running out. He was like an inmate sitting on death row watching the clock tick, unable to stop the inevitable. But this was slightly better. Not much, mind you, but slightly. At least if Joe turned into a werewolf, he wouldn't die. Well, probably not. He was aware that he could die, but since most of the other bears had escaped, he figured he would too. And Joe was, as Yogi always said, smarter than the average bear. What if he was unable to think straight or focus when he turned? What if he couldn't control himself as had been the case in his dreams? Joe didn't want to think about this. Such thoughts would do him no good. He was sitting in front of the TV, Brando the Hutt and Dennis Hopper on screen, but Joe was staring at the window. It occurred to him to stand and close the curtains. As he did, he thought, what the hell am I doing this for? It wasn't like a curtain would stop him from crashing through the window. Looking back on the wolf that had attacked him, Joe remembered him as being huge. Would Joe be that size too? Sure he would, he figured. Why wouldn't he? Joe looked at the screen and saw lard-ass Brando saying, "The horror, the horror." Fuck Brando, he thought. It wasn't that he didn't like Brando, no. Brando was near the top in Joe's cool book. But at this moment, anything and everything pissed Joe off. It was getting dark outside, and Joe knew if he was going to transform, it would happen soon. Sitting on the couch, Joe leaned forward, looking at the floor and running his hands through his hair. He was sweating profusely. His heart was racing, and he felt anxious. Joe started to feel immense pain in his legs and arms and back. The intense searing, burning occurred in all his muscles simultaneously. He arched his back and turned his eyes towards the ceiling, not really seeing it. All he saw was red. He whimpered at first, then he groaned, eventually screaming as his muscles began to enlarge and rip through his clothing, tearing them to shreds. He looked at his arms, huge and expanded, and there was hair covering them. He looked at his hands, now glorified paws. His claws were long and sharp, still slicing their way through his fingertips. Gary was naked, doing a line of coke off the coffee table, feeling the coke burn in his nose and throat. He sat up, looking at Stephanie through watery eyes. "This is good shit," he said. "You sure you don't want any?" "No," she said, having just exhaled a massive bong hit. "This is good for me." "But it's primo shit," Gary said. "You know I don't like coke, but you're always trying to get me to try it," Stephanie said. "Why don't you give it a rest?" Gary grinned a goofy, high-as-fuck grin, nodding like an idiot. "I'm a bad influence, huh?" Stephanie giggled and started to say something funny when the loud howling from upstairs interrupted. "What the fuck was that?" Gary said, startled, his eyes huge. "Fuck if I know," Stephanie said, feeling afraid. "It sounded like a wolf."